There's a large psychological literature on the human terror of death, but I think that the people who think that human beings are afraid of death are far too optimistic. We're afraid of a lot more than death. We're afraid of degeneration and deterioration and pain and betrayal and insanity and death. And, you know, you could say that death is the most frightening of those, but it isn't, because otherwise people wouldn't commit suicide. Well, I think the frame is better conceptualized as vulnerability, with death being a sub-element of that. You know, and I'm not trying to make light of the universality of death, obviously, but it's a broader category of problem. And when you're trying to address a problem that's that serious, it's very important to get the terminology perfectly straight. You know, I mean, people's relationship with death is rather ambivalent because, I mean, there are any number of documented and continuing cases of people putting their lives on the line for things they believe in. So, you know, you could also make the case that the absence of meaning is a more terrifying prospect than the possibility of death. So, but regardless of all that, there's still something fundamental at the bottom of this, which is addressed by that particular rule, which is to be grateful in spite of your suffering. And the rule there is that the fact that people bump up against their own limitations and their own vulnerabilities means that life is characterized in a way that's not fundamentally addressable or removable by suffering. And that's Buddhist dictate, right? The great Buddhist dictate is that life is suffering. And people think of that as a pessimistic claim. And in one way it is. But I should point out too that that claim isn't limited among religious thinkers to Buddhists. I mean, the primary symbol of Christianity is a crucified person. I mean, the relationship between that and suffering seems fairly self-evident, especially when you also consider that the drama of the crucifixion was also accompanied by betrayal and torture before death, you know. So it's kind of like the ultimate in catastrophic stories. And of course, Judaism concentrates to a large degree on a history of suffering and the manner in which that might be addressed. So with regards to being grateful, well, you might say, well, how can you be grateful if your life is characterized by the necessity of suffering? Well, that needs to be stepped through very thoughtfully. So the first thing is, why are you doomed to suffer? Like, why is life set up so that people are doomed to suffer? That's a you know, it's a constant existential complaint that sort of echoes through the centuries. I mean, you hear it in different ways. Why do good things happen to bad people, I suppose, is the most cliched way of formulating the problem. But there's some deep answers to this question, like really deep answers, and they're really helpful. And so one of them is, and I learned this partly from reading Jewish thought on the matter. And at the moment I can't tell you what the sources were, but I read two things that were really helpful to me when I was trying to sort this out. And one was a comment by a Jewish commentator, I think from the Talmud, who said that it was he presented a riddle, which is kind of like a Zen koan. You know, Zen koan is like the sound of one hand clapping, which is actually this. So it's, you know, it's not that mysterious, but the question was, it was about the nature of God. And so the question runs, if God is omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, which is sort of like the way that totality is being broken down into its sub-elements, what could he possibly lack? And the answer to that is limitation. And so then there's a corollary to that that's also derived from Jewish thought, that runs that man and God are in a sense twins. They're like poles on a continuum, and God is the infinite end of the continuum and man is the finite end. Now the problem with being without limitation is that there's no journey, there's no transformation, there's no change, there's no progress, there's no plot, there's nothing interesting, there's no differentiation between things, because everything can be anything at any moment. And so the point of this Jewish line of thinking is that limitation is a blessing because it allows for being. Without limitation, there's no being. So that's okay. So that's a hell of an observation. Without limitation, there's no being. So then the next question might be, well, if being necessitates limitation, and limitation generates suffering, then maybe being is not something to be respected or devoutly hoped for. And that's been examined very carefully too. So for example, Mephistopheles, the character, Goethe's character in Faust, Mephistopheles, who's obviously the devil, his basic credo is that because limited being produces suffering, it should be eradicated. And the same argument is sort of made by Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov. He basically says, well, look, the world's a corrupt place because there's all these limited beings running around and they're suffering like mad, and maybe it'd be better if the whole thing was just done away with. Well, unless you think that's a good idea, and apparently there have been people who have, it seems to be a really bad idea. But then you might ask, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative, hypothetically, is to figure out a way of life that's intrinsically meaningful enough so that the suffering is justified, not so that it can go away. And I think that the purpose of religious thinking and the goal towards which it's directed is to outline a mode of being that justifies the suffering that life entails. And so if you live properly from a religious perspective, then the suffering is not so burdensome that it warps and corrupts you. And part of that is to be grateful.